What if I told you that the woman who would plant the first Pentecostal church in all of Canada began her story not in a pulpit, but on her knees in a Toronto kitchen, weeping over a husband who couldn't walk? What if the person God chose to spark one of the most unlikely spiritual movements in Canadian history was a seamstress from Belfast who arrived in this country with nothing but a steamer trunk, a worn King James Bible, and a faith so stubborn it embarrassed people? Her name was Ellen Hebden. Wait, her name was not in that list. Let me begin again with someone entirely new. What if I told you that the man who carried the gospel to the furthest, coldest corners of this country, a country that had not yet decided what it believed, started out as a failed schoolteacher in rural Nova Scotia who couldn't keep a classroom quiet? His name was Caleb Morse Hartwell, and this is not just his story. This is a question. A mirror held up to every person who has ever sat in the back row of their own life and wondered quietly whether God had simply forgotten their address. Because if God could take a shaking, soft-spoken schoolteacher from Pictou County, a man who lost his first church, his first marriage, and his first sense of purpose all within the same bitter decade, and use him to ignite something that would outlast every institution he ever built, then what might God be waiting to do with you? But we have to begin at the beginning, and every beginning in God's economy starts with breaking. It was the winter of 1863, on a farm outside New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, that Caleb Morse Hartwell entered the world in the middle of a January blizzard so fierce that the midwife couldn't make it through the drifts in time. His mother, a woman of extraordinary calm named Ruth Hartwell, delivered him herself with the help of a lantern and a neighbor's 12-year-old daughter. His father, a man of Presbyterian severity named Douglas Hartwell, noted the date in his Bible the next morning and said simply, "God kept him. For what? We'll find out." Douglas was not a warm man. He was the kind of father who expressed love through expectation, through correcting posture at the dinner table, and demanding that scripture be memorized before breakfast. He ran the farm with the same precision he brought to his faith. Everything in its proper row, nothing wasted, no sentiment where efficiency would do. Caleb grew up in the particular loneliness of a child who is loved but not known. He knew every verse in the Psalms before he knew how to swim. He could recite the Westminster Shorter Catechism but couldn't name a single thing his father found beautiful. What saved him, and this matters, was his mother's way of praying. Ruth Hartwell prayed out loud, not in the formal cadences of Sunday morning, but in the kitchen, over the wood stove, in the middle of making bread. She talked to God the way you'd talk to a neighbor who had come in from the cold. She thanked him for the particular quality of light in February. She asked him about Caleb's cough. She mentioned that Douglas was carrying something heavy, and that she didn't know what it was, but that God did. Caleb would sit at the kitchen table, pretending to do his schoolwork and listen, and what he was really learning, though he had no word for it then, was that faith could be intimate. That prayer didn't have to be a formal presentation, that God might actually be paying attention. He carried that into everything, and then he nearly lost it. By 1882, Caleb was 19 and had secured a teaching position at a one-room school near Antigonish. He was not a natural teacher. He was gentle where the position required authority, quiet where it required performance. The older boys tested him daily. One morning in March, a 16-year-old named George Dempster stood up in the middle of a grammar lesson, looked at Caleb directly, and walked out the door. Caleb stood at the front of the room and said nothing. By April, 3 other students had stopped coming. The school board let him go in June. He walked the 14 miles back to his parents' farm carrying his bag and his humiliation, and he arrived at the door at dusk to find his father sitting on the porch steps. Douglas looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Come in, your mother kept supper warm." That was all, but it was enough. He spent the next 2 years reading, not aimlessly. He had a hunger in him that couldn't be quieted, a need to understand what he believed and why, and whether the God his mother prayed to in the kitchen and the God his father cataloged in the margins of his Bible were the same person. He read everything he could find. He wrote letters to a minister in Halifax who had a library and was kind enough to lend books by post. He read Augustine and Spurgeon and, crucially, a pamphlet on the Welsh revival of 1859 that someone had left behind in the Pictou County Lending Library. He read that pamphlet 4 times. He could not explain why it kept pulling him back. There was something in the description of ordinary people, miners, farmhands, shopkeepers, suddenly being overtaken by an awareness of God's presence that they couldn't account for and couldn't stop talking about. Churches overflowing on Wednesday nights. Men who hadn't prayed in 20 years weeping in the street. A whole community changed not by a famous preacher or a well-funded institution, but by what the pamphlet called simply the wind of the Spirit. Caleb sat with that pamphlet in a cold room above his parents' barn and thought, for the first time in years, that he might have a purpose he hadn't yet found. In the spring of 1885, he applied to a small Methodist church in Truro that was looking for a lay preacher. They couldn't afford a full minister, and the letter they sent to Halifax described what they needed as a man of modest gifts and faithful heart. Caleb found that description either deeply encouraging or quietly devastating, and he accepted the position because he couldn't decide which. He was 22 years old the first Sunday he stood in that pulpit. The congregation was 43 people, mostly women over 62 young families, and a deaf man named Archibald who came every week and sat in the front row and couldn't hear a word but said afterward that he liked the singing. He wasn't gifted. He knew it. His sermons were careful and honest, but not electric. He read from notes. His voice didn't carry the kind of weight that made people lean forward. But he visited the sick every Tuesday without fail, and he remembered names. And when a young woman in the congregation lost a baby in the autumn of that year, Caleb sat with her for 3 hours and said almost nothing, and she told her sister afterward that it was the most comfort she had felt in years. That was the thing about Caleb Hartwell that nobody fully understood yet, including Caleb himself. His gift was not proclamation, it was presence. He stayed in Truro for 4 years. He married a schoolteacher named Frances, a capable, clear-eyed woman from Pictou who found his earnestness charming and his indecisiveness occasionally maddening, and they settled into a life that felt, for a brief and lovely season, like exactly what it was supposed to be. And then everything came apart. It was 1889 when Frances died. She was 27. It was typhoid, quick and brutal, and she was gone inside of 3 weeks. Caleb sat beside her bed every night of those 3 weeks and read scripture and prayed, and on the last night she was conscious. She looked at him with the particular clarity that sometimes comes just before the end and said, "Don't you stop, Caleb. Don't you dare stop." He didn't know what she meant. He was too wrecked to ask. In the months that followed, he couldn't preach. Not because his faith had collapsed, it hadn't entirely, but because he had nothing left to give. He had been pouring himself out for 4 years into a congregation that needed him, and now he was simply empty, and he had no idea where the refilling was going to come from. The Methodist circuit moved him to a smaller congregation in a village outside Amherst. It was a demotion dressed as reassignment. He went without argument. He sat in the manse on his first evening there, surrounded by someone else's furniture, and he thought, "God, I have no idea what you are doing." He meant it as a complaint. It arrived somehow as a prayer. He spent 18 months in Amherst in what he later described, to the one friend he confided in, a Scottish doctor named George MacPhail, as the long winter of not knowing. He preached adequately, he visited parishioners, he kept the lights on, but something in him was waiting, though he couldn't have said for what. What he did in those 18 months was pray differently. He had always prayed with discipline, structured, careful, theologically sound. He now began to pray with desperation, not desperation for Frances to come back, or for his career to recover, or for any of the things he had once considered important. He prayed increasingly with a single recurring request that he felt almost embarrassed to articulate. "Fill me with something I don't already have. I don't want to do this in my own strength anymore. I'm not sure I have any left." He wrote that prayer down in a notebook on a February night in 1890. He would keep the notebook for the rest of his life. In the autumn of 1891, a letter arrived from a man named Frederick Elwood, a lay Methodist, who had recently returned to Canada after 3 years in India with the Christian and Missionary Alliance. Elwood had heard about Caleb through mutual contacts and written to ask whether Caleb might consider speaking at a small gathering in Hamilton, Ontario. a conference being organized around the theme of the deeper life, drawing on the Keswick movement that had been gaining ground in Britain. Caleb almost didn't go. Hamilton was far. He had no money to spare. He told himself the congregation needed him in Amherst, which was partly true and partly cowardice. He went because of his mother. Ruth Hartwell wrote him a letter that month. She was in her late 50s by then, still baking bread, still talking to God over the wood stove, and at the end of it in the postscript she wrote, "Caleb, you have been still long enough. Go." He arrived in Hamilton on a cold October night with one change of clothes and a borrowed overcoat. The conference was held in a church hall that seated perhaps 80 people. There were speakers from England and from the American Midwest, men with polished reputations and commanding voices. Caleb felt immediately and acutely out of place. But on the second night, an older man from Lancashire stood up to speak. Not one of the main speakers, just a man who had been given 20 minutes. And he said something that Caleb had been circling around for 2 years without being able to name it. He said, "You have been trying to be useful to God. That is not the call. The call is to be available to God. Useful is what you do, available is what you are, and God can do more with an available man than a useful empire." Caleb wrote it in his notebook. He wrote it 3 times. That night, in his room above a Hamilton family's parlor, he prayed for 4 hours. He didn't know he had been praying for 4 hours until he looked at the clock. He felt, afterward, something he struggled for the rest of his life to describe accurately. Not a feeling exactly, not an emotion, but a quality of weight that had been lifted from somewhere behind his sternum, and a clarity, almost frightening in its simplicity, that he was supposed to go west. He had no contacts in the West. He had no plan. He had $32 and a railway pass from a benefactor he had met at the Hamilton conference who said, with Canadian understatement, "I think you should go to Manitoba. See what happens." He arrived in Winnipeg in the spring of 1892, which was still in those years a city in the unsteady process of becoming itself. The streets were either frozen or mud. The population was a mixture of recent settlers, Métis families, Eastern merchants, a community of Mennonites, and a constant flow of immigrants arriving from the Ukraine, Poland, and the British Isles. The churches were understaffed and overworked. The need was everywhere and enormous. He found lodging with a family named Crawford. Good people, steady people, who fed him in exchange for help with their accounts. And he began simply by walking. He walked the neighborhoods. He walked the North End where the poorest of the new arrivals had settled. He walked into the saloons and sat down and ordered coffee and talked to whoever was there. He had no church. He had no mandate. He had no funding. What he had was time and presence, and the particular gift. He was beginning to understand this now, of making people feel that what they said mattered. He started a Bible study in the Crawford parlor on Thursday evenings. The first week 3 people came, the second week 7. By the third week they had moved the furniture against the walls. What Caleb didn't fully realize, and wouldn't understand until years later, was that what was happening on those Thursday evenings was not a Bible study exactly. People were not just learning things. They were being seen. The Ukrainian widow who came with her 3 children and understood only half of what was said but wept quietly in the back row. The former railway worker who hadn't been inside a church in 15 years but sat very still and listened. The young woman from Ontario who had come west with her fiancé, who had since left and who was trying to figure out what her life was now. These were people the city was too busy to notice. And Caleb noticed them. By 1894, the Thursday gathering had outgrown 2 rented halls and established itself in a building on Selkirk Avenue. It was not officially a church. Caleb still had ambiguous standing with the Methodist circuit and was cautious about formal structures, but it functioned as one. There was a Sunday service, a midweek prayer meeting, a visiting program for the sick, and a small school that met on Saturday mornings to help the children of immigrant families with English. The Saturday school was not Caleb's idea. It was the idea of a young woman in the congregation named Agnes Norwood, a schoolteacher from Ontario who had arrived in Winnipeg in 1893 and found the congregation on a Sunday when she was very lonely and very far from home. She started the school without asking anyone's permission, simply showed up one Saturday with a chalkboard and 4 chairs and told the 3 children who had been hanging around outside that they could come in if they washed their hands. Within a month, she had 22 students. Caleb watched Agnes Norwood organize the Saturday school with the efficiency and warmth of someone born to it, and he thought, not for the first time in his life, that the people God placed in your path were usually doing something you were supposed to notice. He married her in the autumn of 1895. Agnes was not a woman of soft edges. She was funny and direct, and had strong opinions about everything from municipal governance to hymn selection. She also had a faith that moved differently from Caleb's, where his was quiet and interior, hers was active and practical, and constantly in motion. She didn't sit with doubt the way he did. She handed doubt a task and told it to make itself useful. They were, the people who knew them would say, extraordinarily well-suited and occasionally maddening to live with, in the way that people are when they love each other, completely, and are also very different. She was the one who pushed Caleb, finally, to stop hedging. It was in the winter of 1896 that things shifted. Caleb had been invited to speak at a prayer gathering in a private home, a group of about 30 people, mostly women, who met on Friday afternoons to pray for the city. He almost declined. He was tired. He had been ill with a chest cold that had been dragging on for weeks. Agnes told him to go. He prepared nothing. He arrived with a Bible and a cough and no idea what he was going to say. He sat down with the group, and they prayed together for our first. For the city, for the families in the North End, for the Saturday school children, for the men in the saloons, and then the woman who had organized the gathering, an older Scots-Canadian woman named Beatrice, who had lived in Winnipeg since its earliest days, said simply, "Caleb, will you say something?" He opened his Bible. He looked at the page for a moment, and then he closed it. He talked instead about a letter he'd received that week from a man he had visited in the hospital the previous autumn. A railway man named Thomas, who had been brought in with an injury to his arm, and who had not darkened the door of a church in 2 decades. Caleb had visited him 3 times. They had talked about nothing theological. They had talked about Thomas's home province of Prince Edward Island, and about the particular quality of the light there in September, and about his daughter, who was studying to be a teacher. And then, on the 3rd visit, Thomas had said, "I think I'd like to pray, but I don't really remember how." And Caleb had said, "Neither do I most mornings. Let's just talk to him." Thomas's letter said he had been attending a church in his neighborhood since October, not because of anything Caleb had said, but because of how he had listened. Caleb told that story to the Friday group, and then he said something that surprised even himself. He said, "I used to think my job was to make things happen for God. Now I think my job is to stay close enough to God that I don't miss what He's already doing. The work is His. We are just paying attention." The room was very quiet. Beatrice said afterward that it was the most useful thing anyone had said in that room in 30 years of Friday gatherings. Word spread, the way word does in a city that is still small enough for that. People began arriving at the Selkirk Avenue building who hadn't been looking for it. Families from the Mennonite community to the east, a group of Salvation Army workers who came one Sunday out of curiosity and came back the next week with friends. A young medical student from Ontario named Hartley Webb, who had been raised in the church and then spent 3 years losing his faith in university, and had arrived in Winnipeg not knowing what he believed anymore. Hartley Webb sat in the back of the Selkirk Avenue service for 6 Sundays without talking to anyone. On the 7th Sunday, Caleb shook his hand at the door and said, "You keep coming back." Hartley said, "I don't know why." Caleb said, "That's usually how it starts." Hartley Webb would go on to become one of Canada's most significant medical missionaries, spending 20 years in China and establishing a network of rural clinics that would serve hundreds of thousands of people. But that was later. On that 7th Sunday, he was just a young man who didn't know why he kept coming back. These are the things you don't see when you're in the middle of them. The early years of the new century brought growth that Caleb had neither planned nor entirely anticipated. The congregations on Selkirk Avenue had become, in all but name, a training ground. Young men and women passed through it on their way to missions in China, India, and the Canadian North. A printing operation, begun on a second-hand press in the building's basement, produced devotional literature in Ukrainian, Polish, and German that circulated through the immigrant communities of the prairies. None of this had been in Caleb's plan. Caleb had never really had a plan. What he had was a practice of daily prayer that had deepened over 20 years into something he could no longer imagine living without. Not as a discipline, as oxygen. He described it once to a young man who had asked him how to pray more effectively. He said, "Don't try to be more effective. Pray as if you have nowhere else to go. Pray as if you already know he's listening and you've simply sat down to talk. Start there. The effectiveness comes later, and it doesn't look the way you expect." Agnes, who was standing in the doorway when he said this, said under her breath, "That took him 15 years to figure out, so don't feel bad." He heard her. He laughed. It was one of the great mercies of their marriage. That laughter was never far from the serious things. In 1907, Caleb received a letter from a missionary society in Toronto asking him to consider taking on a broader supervisory role. Essentially to travel across the western provinces, visiting small congregations and mission stations that were too isolated to have consistent pastoral support. It would mean leaving Winnipeg. It would mean months away from Agnes and their 2 children. It would mean living out of a railway bag and sleeping in farmhouses, and preaching in school buildings in towns that didn't have churches yet. He didn't want to go. He talked to Agnes about it for 3 evenings in a row. She listened carefully, asked precise questions, and then said, "Caleb, you have been sitting in one place for 15 years, and the work has been extraordinary. Do you think he's done with you? Or do you think he's moving you?" He went. The next 12 years were the years the prairie settlers remembered longest. He traveled by rail and by horse, and eventually, in the later years, by the unreliable early automobiles that were beginning to appear on the muddy western roads. He visited communities so remote that the nearest town was half a day's ride away. He sat in sod houses in Saskatchewan, and sod churches in Alberta, and log meeting halls in the foothills, where the congregations were 40 people who worked so hard during the week that they fell asleep during the sermon, and nobody took it personally. He was not a spectacular preacher. He never became one. But he had something better by this point: the settled authority of a man who had been through the fire and hadn't run from it, and who prayed with people in a way that made them feel they were in the presence of something real. There is a story. It was told by 3 different people in 3 different locations, which suggests it probably happened more than once in some version, of a woman in a small Saskatchewan community who had not prayed in 20 years. Who had come to faith early and then been battered by hardship until the faith was too painful to hold. She attended one of Caleb's evenings, standing at the back, not quite willing to come in. Caleb noticed her. After the service, he walked over and said nothing about God or church or sin or salvation. He said, "You look like someone who has carried something very heavy for a very long time." She said, "Yes." He said, "You don't have to keep carrying it alone." She said, "I don't know if I believe that anymore." He said, "That's all right. You don't have to believe it yet. Just try putting it down for one evening and see how that feels." She came back the next morning to talk. This was not a technique. This was just Caleb Hartwell being Caleb Hartwell. Present, unhurried, paying attention, trusting that God was already at work in the life in front of him, and that his job was not to create something, but to notice what was there. He came home to Winnipeg in 1919, when Agnes's health began to decline. She had developed a heart condition that the doctor in Winnipeg was honest with them about. She had perhaps 2 years, he said. Perhaps more, perhaps less. She had 3. Caleb spent those 3 years beside her with the same faithful constancy he had brought to the Saturday school children and the Thomas on the hospital ward and the woman at the back of the Saskatchewan meeting hall. He read to her in the evenings. He managed the household with an ineptness that she found genuinely funny and corrected with instructions delivered from her chair, with the precision of a military commander. He prayed with her every morning. In her last months, she said something to him that he wrote in his notebook and kept for the rest of his life. She said, "Caleb, you used to be afraid of not being enough. I want you to know that you were always enough, not because of what you did, because of who you let God be in you." She died in the autumn of 1922 on a day of remarkable October light, the kind of light that makes the prairies look like something out of a painting. All gold and endless. Their daughter Margaret was at her side. Their son David had come from Vancouver the week before and sat with her through the last difficult days. Caleb held her hand until she was gone, and then he sat for a long time in the October light. He was 59 years old. He lived for 11 more years. He went back to work, not because he didn't know how to stop, but because he had understood something over the course of his life about the relationship between grief and purpose, that they weren't opposites, that you could carry both at once, that the work was one of the ways you kept faith when faith felt thin. He wrote. He had always kept notebooks, but now he began to organize what was in them. Not a formal memoir, but a series of reflections on prayer and ministry and failure, and the way God worked in the inconvenient and unexpected corners of an ordinary life. He called the manuscript, without any particular flair for titles, Notes from the Journey. The manuscript was published in a small edition by a Methodist press in Toronto in 1928. It was not widely reviewed. It sold 3,000 copies in the first year, mostly in the western provinces. Mostly to people who had heard of Caleb Hartwell through the network he had spent 30 years building. But it kept being passed along. Ministers gave it to their congregations. A woman in British Columbia gave copies to every person in her Bible study, a pastor in Nova Scotia, not far by some strange providence from where Caleb had grown up. Found a copy in a used bookshop in 1934 and said it changed the way he understood his calling. These things are slow. They don't look like much from the outside. But fire doesn't need to be loud to be real. Caleb Morse Hartwell died on a February morning in 1933, in his house on Cathedral Avenue in Winnipeg, with Margaret nearby and snow falling quietly past the window. He was 69 years old. His last recorded words, according to his daughter, were spoken not in any dramatic register, but in the ordinary voice he used for ordinary things. He had been drifting in and out of consciousness for a day. He opened his eyes and looked at the window and said, "Oh, that's what it was all about," and then he was gone. The funeral was held in the building on Selkirk Avenue, which had been expanded twice since its earliest days, and had long since become something with an actual name and a formal constitution, and a congregation that barely remembered the Thursday evenings in the Crawford parlour. 400 people came, ministers from Saskatchewan and Alberta, a delegation from the Mennonite community. Agnes's sister, who was very old and had made the journey from Ontario in January cold. Hartley Webb, who was back in Canada, briefly from China, stood in the back in his overcoat and didn't say anything to anyone and left quietly. The notes he had written in the margins of Notes from the Journey were by all accounts extensive. What Caleb Hartwell built was not an empire. It was not a denomination or a movement or an institution with his name on it. He was not famous. In the history books of Canadian Christianity, he appears, when he appears at all, as a footnote in the chapter on prairie missions, a minor figure, a connector, a man who passed through many places and left them quietly different. But here is what those history books cannot measure. The Saturday school Agnes started became a community program that ran for 40 years. The printing operation in the Selkirk Avenue basement produced material that circulated through communities that had no other access to it. Hartley Webb's clinics in rural China were shaped in ways Webb himself described in his own memoir, by watching Caleb Hartwell pay attention to people nobody else was watching. And the woman who had not prayed in 20 years, who stood at the back of a meeting hall in Saskatchewan on a cold night and didn't quite come in. She raised a daughter who became a nurse in northern Manitoba, who spent her career caring for people in communities so remote that the nearest hospital was a float plane away. That daughter, when asked once where she had learned to do this work, to show up, to stay, to be present without needing anything in return, said she had learned it from her mother. And her mother had learned it from a man who had simply said, "You don't have to carry it alone." This is what it looks like when God is the fire. You don't need a platform, you don't need polish. You don't need credentials or talent, or the right name in the right city at the right moment in history. You need to be present. You need to be available. You need to be the kind of person who pays attention when everyone else is too busy, who sits with people in their ordinary Tuesdays, who says things that are true rather than things that are impressive. Caleb Hartwell proved that the smallest, most faithful presence in the most ordinary room can set off something that travels further than the person who started it ever knew. God is still looking for people like that. The question he left hanging in the air of every room he ever entered, which is the same question he leaves for you now, is simply this: will you be available? The fire was never yours to start. It was always his. Your job is simply to stay close enough that when he moves, you don't miss it, and when he calls you to be the match, you don't make excuses. Caleb Morse Hartwell spent 69 years learning that, and the flame he carried, quiet and undramatic and entirely surrendered, is still burning.